Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us today. Thank you so much and welcome back to DDP Podcasts. I'm very excited for this particular podcast segment. It's in alignment with our Migration Project Month. If you have not been following our social media platforms this month, I trust that you will get some hint of what it is we've been trying to cover this month in celebrating migrants in South Africa, but overall migrant issues and bringing attention to those particular issues within the South African context. The migration conference is actually happening on the 29th of September. Obviously, RSVPs to join at the venue itself are closed at this point, but you're more than welcome to join us through the live stream on YouTube or on our Facebook page. And all details regarding that are available on the DDP social media platforms. With that housekeeping out of the way, I am very honored to introduce our guest for this podcast. Joining me today is David Kabwa, and he's got many titles, but the one that we've actually chosen to highlight for today is that David is a South African ambassador to the United 2030 initiative. And very excited to have a conversation with you, David. David's longer bio is attached right here on the podcast information details, so you can go ahead and quickly check that out to make sure that he is in fact credible to be having this conversation with us. But before we start with anything, David, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Yanga. Look forward to a fantastic conversation, one that is very pertinent, one that is very timeous, and one that is very critical to what we see happening not only in South Africa, but in the world. So thank you for having me.
Great. David, we can just go right into it. I think, matters of migration are somewhat scattered for a lot of people. What is a migration issue in Italy, which I think is a very interesting country right now, versus what is a migration issue in Norway, or what is a migration issue within the African context, something that is very, very different. But I want to ask you, in your opinion, what does migration look like in the 21st century?
I appreciate that. And again, I think it's a really good question. Traditionally, when we think of migration, we think about migration in the context of forced migration, being that people are trying to escape something, be it a war, be it famine, essentially any kind of situation and circumstance that creates a situation where one cannot stay in their country of origin. For whatever reason. And what we've seen in the 21st century is a rise in economic migration, which essentially has to do with one of the biggest driving factors behind migration being that of economics. And in the 21st century, and particularly the African context, we've seen a bigger rise in the form of economic migration. Although we do have a lot of non-state actors and very kind of porous borders in terms of what is happening in the African continent, what we are seeing is that one of the biggest motivating factors is people are driven by creating a better economic means for themselves, for their families, and just improving life. So it is not uncommon in Africa to have a family where the breadwinner is living in one African country, sending money back home to another, and where you'll find border crossings on the regular. This seems to be one of the most prevalent factors that we are experiencing. So definitely 21st century migration, a lot more economic in nature, but it does not negate the role that forced migration still play.
Given the economic migration that is occurring, how do you think the xenophobic ideas, particularly here in South Africa, have come up as a result of this economic migration?
I appreciate that. And again, a very pertinent question. I actually had the exact same question last week during the International Day commemorating peace, where I was engaging with the African Mediation Association. And there was a young man from Nigeria who asked the same question, which is always pressing. So I've always held the view that what we are experiencing in South Africa is not so much xenophobia, it is Afrophobia. And the reason why I use that term deliberately is because when we speak of a disconnect between foreign nationals and South Africans in particular, it seems to be skewed towards foreign nationals from other African countries. This is where the main focus seems to be. It does not negate the difficulties that foreign nationals from non-African contextualities are facing, but we are seeing that the focus seems to be on Africa. Now, the reason for this, in my view, is essentially a disconnect in terms of proper communication for a variety of reasons. There are politically motivated factors. As we mentioned, there are economically motivated factors, and then obviously socially motivated factors. So the politics behind it all, you might have heard of a familiar group referred to as Operation Gudula. And essentially what this group seeks to do, according to their own communications, is simply ensure the empowerment of South African people, and that should anyone seek to prosper in the country, they must do so in a way that is legal. Yet it seems that most of the activism they participate in seems to target non-South African Africans living in South Africa. And the belief there is that this is very highly politically motivated, and in economic context, there is the unfortunate misinterpretation that a foreign national in South Africa is going to remove the economic agency of non-South Africans by engaging in trade, particularly in the informal sector, which has caused concern for some people with the belief that because it is in the informal sector, it is not highly regulated. Therefore, the Afrophobia manifests in some South Africans seeking to regulate it themselves by whatever means necessary. And then lastly, in terms of, again, what we're seeing with the third contextuality, I think it is very much kind of indicative of the fact that we simply misunderstand the facts of the matter. It is a highly emotional space. It is a highly emotional time. Our country, much like many countries, have very difficult issues. And what we find is that when we are able to, quote unquote, identify the root cause of that issue, we become very passionate in the pursuit of rectifying a perceived wrong. Now, the issue then comes in that perceived wrong is pointed towards foreign nationals and migrants, hence the disconnect that we see in the form of Afrophobia, in particular, the view and the belief that you are not rightfully here, and therefore your being here is to my disadvantage and I must do something about it. It is why I believe platforms such as this and the work that your organization have been doing is so important, because not only does it allow for agency, but it allows for education. Miscommunication breeds dissatisfaction, and that often leads to very negative effects. And the best way to mitigate that is to ensure clear communication. Clear communication occurs when the relevant facts are provided, and I believe platforms such as this create that opportunity.
Oh, there we go. You know, you're absolutely right about how people respond to migration issues. I think particularly this month as we've been promoting this type of content. One might think that, you know, this Afrophobia is something that is limited to the streets, going up to a foreign national and physically attacking them. But these views transcend beyond that. I mean, some of the engagement and some of the comments that we've gotten from South Africans, you know, given that most of the time their accounts are ghost accounts, but we know that there's definitely a person behind it, where they kind of spewing that narrative that, why are you guys even promoting these kinds of things? These people are coming to take our jobs and they're coming to ruin the economy and all of that. And it's a global phenomenon, right? It's not just something that is a South African issue in how people engage with migration stuff. Just looking at the Italian politics very recently, with the new prime minister, one of the big key issues that she's pushing for is clamping down, so to speak, on more migrants that are coming into Italy, not even necessarily for an economic benefit, but because they are genuinely fleeing. But they don't see it like that. It's this idea of preserving national identity, or whatever that actually means, but that's a debate for another day. But I just wanted to bring a little bit more on a practical level, the effects this economic migration might have on policies such as, well, they're not being implemented yet, but the vision is there, a policy such as the African Free Trade Continental Agreement. How does economic migration affect that?
Right. Sorry for that. I appreciate that, which is, again, a very, very good question. The African Free Continental Trade Area essentially seeks to create a new economic bloc, which is something that I'm very excited about and I think is very, very necessary. To give you an example, we have very many agreements on the continent. I will not refer to particular countries in this instance, but there are certain states we have with laws for trade that simply do not make sense. I would have to ship something off the continent to ship it back onto the continent in another country. These are policy directives that simply make no sense. When we look at one of the most predominant trading blocs that we see in the world today, that being the European Union, it allows for essentially free movement, free trade, and what has empowered Europe to becoming a strong regional entity with a great level of agency in the world. Your example pertaining to the new Italian prime minister, I think, is one that is very topical and very pertinent. And the reason for that is because one of the biggest disputes around the Ukrainian crisis, the war between Russia and Ukraine, has been on the question of refugees, has been on the question of the movement of peoples and how that affects the economic bloc. And just very, very briefly, one, it is believed that President Putin has been motivated by three factors, the one being economic, the other one being social, and the other one being security, for obvious reasons. I'll touch on only the economic matter for the purpose of this conversation, linking it back to migration. So the belief has been, if Ukraine can join the European Union, then the resources of Ukraine can be better distributed within the EU. The current modus operandi before the war has been a great level of engagement with Russia, and then through Russia engaging with Ukraine as far as resource allocation and kind of economic agency. So there were some very interesting arrangements in that regard. Now, the reason why I bring this up in relation to the African Free Continental Trade Area is because within the European Union, what we've seen is when there has been a disconnect within, and I use this word again, within, the area of trade, the ripple effect on the entire union has been felt and resonates within the space of migration as well. Now, the African Free Continental Trade Area, as I believe we're all familiar with, seeks to essentially allow for better trade on the African continent, to ensure that some of the policies in place that are not beneficial to Africa as a continent do not become an impediment to our ability to trade in an intra-African manner. And what we find is that there is the belief and the hope, as you mentioned, the continental free trade area still is in development, but the belief and the hope is that it will allow for greater regional resource integration, as well as resource allocation, which will have a ripple effect that will positively influence the people on the continent to develop new areas of trade, to develop new areas of industrialization, and to remove the dependency that Africa has had on a Western-centric power block as it pertains to trade. And the hope is also that as African countries, communities, and Africa as a region becomes more financially independent and develops a greater level of agency, that this will mitigate the economic driving factors that allow for migration to take place. Essentially, if my economy is improving, then I am not as motivated to leave a bustling economy in favor of going to another African state where I might find that opportunity. So in short, the African Free Continental Trade Area will essentially shrink the distance that has existed between African countries and communities. It will open up channels of trade, and it will decrease the dependency that we have in the neoliberal world in which we find ourselves on the West, and therefore create a space where Africans can benefit from what Africa has to offer.
Yeah, no, it is quite an exciting initiative, I must say. I was reading an article the other day that was analyzing how this Western-centric model of trade that still is in Africa as a result of, colonialism and the effects of it. A country like Chad, which is so land locked that they don't necessarily have ocean trade, but they also quite a relatively dry area. It's become, the capital city of Chad has become one of the most expensive places actually in Africa to live in. And a lot of people are moving away from the urban cities to go more so to the rural areas again, to do farming, etc., because it's just not a sustainable model, specifically in that country. So it'll be very interesting to see, how the free trade agreement works in terms of an economic level, but also very interesting to see how it will work in terms of a social level, on how Africans interact with other Africans, in terms of, your conflict-ridden areas, which, currently right now we have the situation in Rwanda and parts of Congo, which is inherently, underneath it, one might argue that there's a tribalism issue going on there, but we know that it is an economic issue, the reasoning for that conflict happening there. But it was very interesting to see how the social dynamics will work out at that point. But I just want to go back actually to that first question I asked you about what does migration look like in the 21st century? And I want us to maybe project on the future. Given the context of climate change, and what climate change is doing to accelerate and to create somewhat new migration issues, not necessarily new, but migration issues that are a bit more proliferated than they would have been in the past. So for example, how Pakistan had flooded and nearly 40 million people were displaced. And as a result of that displacement, the climate has placed people in the position of having to move completely away from their countries. And same thing is happening right now in Puerto Rico, along with many other countries across the world because of what's going on in our environment. Do you think that in the future, we're going to start engaging with this migration thing beyond the traditional, it's because of economics, it's because of social. We now are perhaps going to have to be engaging with it on what are the effects climate is going to have in terms of how human beings, because of evolution, are going to be moving around the world.
Right. Again, it's a brilliant question. The short answer is yes. I do think it will play a very major role, and as we mentioned in the beginning, in the 21st century, the role of migration and the way in which it manifests is always shifting. We've seen this in nature already. There's very popular images in circulation of a polar bear on a singular ice cap that seems to be floating in an endless ocean that seemingly came out of nowhere due to ice caps melting. We've seen that animals that would not appear in certain areas are suddenly drawn to areas where they can better acclimate to a changing climate. In many countries where there is a very close link between urban areas and nature, we are seeing animals encroach more and more and more into urban areas. I saw a documentary on a troop of monkeys in, I believe, India, it was, that had essentially had their ecosystem change. And they've now adapted to living in urban areas where you'll find they're so comfortable with cities and city life and humans that they have literally created or adapted to a new way to function. And what we are seeing, what we see now, and what we will continue to see is that in future this will develop more, particularly on the point of climate change. As we mentioned, quite a number of factors that contribute to migration. You might find among those factors are the environmental factors, where we see climate change playing a very prolific role in areas where drought becomes more prevalent. People will migrate. In areas where we see flooding occur, people will migrate. This is both inter and intra-state migration. And there I'll give a very Western-centric example. I believe it was Los Angeles, if not Las Vegas, that had a high level of flooding recently, levels that they had never seen before. And many of the residents had taken up moving across state lines to seek a better life. So how much more so when your country, your state, is changing in such a way that the only option that you do have is to move across the border and seek a better life. We are seeing that the unit of analysis when we are discussing migration is shifting. So normally the unit of analysis was always pertaining to people and how they relate to both economics and how they relate to forced factors in whatever form they might be. Climate change is very quickly changing that. Another example is various entities, NGOs, and particularly the civil society sector have been engaged in fundraising efforts to try and prepare for an influx of immigrants, particularly for immigrants who were escaping because of environmental factors caused by climate change. We are seeing in some countries the legislation itself is shifting to seek to address this. A very silly example is if you have to tick on a box and your options are forced factors or economic factors, and neither one seems to apply to you, then we have to create a third box that you will be able to tick that applies to your situation. And with this silly example, we are seeing that in terms of climate change, it is what is occurring, and it allows us to identify that these matters are intersectional because It might be climate, but there might be a crossover between climate and finance. There might be a crossover between climate and war. There might be a crossover between social factors and economic factors and climate-based factors that we see in the environment. So there is a great level of fluidity when it comes to migration within the 21st century. And I think one of the most prevalent places we are seeing that is in the climate sector.
Right. David, before I let you go, I've got one last question for you. You can't be on a democracy development program podcast without talking about democracy. And the question that I just want to ask is, given the work that you are involved with the Centre for Mediation in Africa, how would you project the relationship between migration and democracy from a South African perspective, but overall on the African continent as a whole?
Right, thank you for that. It's an excellent question. So within the Centre for Mediation in Africa, what we do is we seek to essentially bolster mediation on the African continent through academia, through practice, through teaching, and through kind of reimagining and reevaluating what mediation looks like in the 21st century. So very topical in terms of our conversation. One of the issues that we look at within mediation is that of transitional justice. And for any who might not be familiar, transitional justice is essentially the process of ensuring that due diligence and a just set of procedures and processes have been followed from one level of transition to another. So this can be the transition from a conflict situation, such as a civil war, to a post-conflict situation, such as a space where a transitional government must be set up to carry a country forward after a conflict had taken place. Now, the way this links to democracy is you will find within the transitional justice process, in the African contextuality in particular, transitional justice recognizes retributive justice, but leans more towards restorative justice. And essentially the difference there is, think of the Nuremberg trials that took place against Nazi Germany. The focus there was retributive, to punish people for wrongdoings. That was a form of justice that was very prevalent. What we are seeing now in the African contextuality is we have these amazing philosophies such as that of Ubuntu, which says, I am what I am because of who you are. That's where we see restorative justice playing a very prominent role, with the belief that a greater emphasis should be placed on reconciliation, but also on reintegration. Now, the reconciliation and reintegration is very important because it has to do with how the society functions, how society is made up, the makeup of society. That society in a post-conflict situation must have the ability to make a choice and to make a conscientious decision, because that will determine who is in power. And those in power determine the policy parameters as it pertains to very key issues such as migration. Therefore, having the previously marginalized involved in a transitional justice process represented in a mediation process allows for a greater level of representation. That representation often translates into their ability to be recognized in a society, in a post-conflict situation where they're eligible to participate in the democratic process of voting, and through that democratic process are then able to have an influence on key issues such as migration, particularly from the perspective of offenders that have been reintegrated into the communities, and victims that have suffered some kind of offense that has marginalized them and affected their agency. So it gives people back their agency, those that were victims, those that we're offenders in a way that promotes unity to be reflected at the highest levels. I think that's the effect that we see in terms of mediation, how that would manifest in democracy, and that would have a direct effect on matters such as migration.
Sure. Thank you, David, so much for all of that. I think this was a very fruitful conversation. Could definitely go on for much longer. But I think we can definitely just end it here. To everybody that was listening in, please do feel free to give us your commentary on how you found this podcast, your views actually on some of the topics that we were discussing over here. We are much more likely going to have this type of conversation again in the future, and your contributions and your views from the audience would be really lovely to hear exactly what it is you would like us to discuss a bit further regarding this topic. But with that being said, David, thank you so much for joining us today. I really do appreciate it. To those who are obviously listening to the podcast, is currently just waved goodbye. If you're watching it on YouTube, you just saw he just waved goodbye. But yeah, we really do appreciate it, David. Like I said, the migration conference is happening on the 29th of September. You are free to join us over Zoom, free to join us over Facebook Live, and we will also be live streaming it on YouTube. And the link details regarding that conference are going to be attached below this podcast. If you miss it, that's simply okay. The recording will already be available for you on our YouTube page of the live stream. With that being said, thank you very much, everybody. I will see you in our next podcast segment.